In the fall of 1997, the historic neighborhood of Old West Austin was booming. Developers, entrepreneurs, and real estate agents were scooping up properties to build luxury condos or restore old, worn-down homes to their former glory. Even the smallest rundown lots were easily selling for six figures. But there was one house on Blanco Street that nobody wanted to touch. The lawn was overgrown, the front porch was rotting and falling apart, tattered blankets covered the windows, and neighbors said that on days when the wind blew just right, the smell of urine and feces seeped from the house and onto the street. Not only was the property run down and dilapidated, it was eerie. A strange moaning sound could often be heard coming from inside the home. It sounded almost animalistic. One local said it was like a haunted house in a fairy tale. You'd walk past and ask yourself, what could possibly be going on in there? The home was thought to be occupied by two women, an elderly lady named Edna Barr and her daughter Diana, a petite woman in her late 40s. And while the two women seemed a little odd and reclusive, it wasn't them that neighbors were concerned about. It was a little girl that would appear in the window of the rundown home. In fact, people were so baffled by her that in December of 1994, an anonymous call was placed to the Child Protective Services hotline, inquiring about the occupants inside the house. When a CPS caseworker finally stepped foot inside, nothing could have prepared her for how horrific the conditions were. The news of the young girl sent shockwaves through Austin. Nobody had seen anything like it, and the more everyone learned about her and her life, the more outrage they got. I'm Brooke, and thanks for tuning in to Armchair Investigator. Today, we'll be discussing the case of Victoria Barr, a girl who spent her entire childhood hidden away inside a rat-infested home. In December of 1994, a concerned citizen placed an anonymous call to the Child Protective Services hotline, inquiring about the occupants inside the Barr's house. CPS never followed up, citing insufficient information. About a month later, a second call about the little girl was made. That call, too, went unanswered. Finally, after a third call was made in October of 1995, a CPS investigator went to the Barr's home. Diana signed a safety plan agreeing to improve the living conditions, and life resumed as usual for the next 2 years, with no follow-ups or additional home visits from CPS. It wasn't until October of 1997, when a fourth call was made to CPS, that a caseworker went to the house and asked to step inside. That caseworker was Catherine Allen, and nothing could have prepared her for what she was about to see. The Barrs had long stopped maintaining the outside of their home, and the inside was no better. In fact, out of the 9-room house, the only rooms they could occupy were the living room, the dining room, and a small bathroom. Crammed into the living room were several beaten-up couches, a refrigerator, and a microwave. A few more couches and a cot were in the dining room. The bathroom was covered in dirt, and dried feces had been smeared all over the walls. Rats were everywhere. They were climbing the windows, digging through trash, and burrowing under piles of paper. Catherine later wrote in a court affidavit, "The rats were not afraid of humans and didn't run away." Victoria, the young girl neighbors had seen in the window, was also there. She was sitting on a filthy mattress wearing a urine-soaked nightgown. Her hair was matted down, most of her teeth were rotten, and her feet were covered in dirt. At 9 years old, Victoria was unable to speak. In fact, the only noises she made were squeaking sounds. It was as if she was imitating the rats. Victoria had never played outside, had never been around other children, and had never been to school. On October 20th, caseworkers and police officers removed Victoria from the home and took her to the Children's Shelter and Assessment Center of Texas, an organization that handles the city's most severe cases of neglect. At the time, staff had never seen anything like her. Even the other children staying there stared in disbelief. Victoria arrived at CSACT frightened and draped in a sheet. She urinated on the floor and attempted to cover it up like a cat. When staff tried giving Victoria a bath, she seemed shocked by the bathtub and bubbles. It was as if she had no idea what a bathtub was actually used for. It took more than an hour to get her into the water. Afterwards, she huddled in a corner next to a mattress that had been placed on the floor for her. making squeaking sounds over and over. She drank only water and would only eat bread, throwing all other foods given to her on the ground. People couldn't help comparing her to the wild child found in southern France in 1800, who would come to be known as Victor. You see, Victor had emerged from a nearby forest, and villagers believed the boy to be about 12 years old. His food preferences, lack of speech, animalistic behavior, and scars on his body indicated that he had been in the wild for most of his life. Victor presented a unique and rare opportunity. He gave those around him a chance to see human nature stripped of society and culture. Some doctors believed that Victor was profoundly and intellectually delayed from birth and unable to learn, while others thought that Victor was delayed because of his years of living in the wild. Victoria's condition outraged the public. They wanted answers. How could this have happened? And in a bustling neighborhood that was less than a mile from the state capital. A citizens' committee was created to investigate how the city and state had let a little girl fall through the cracks, unnoticed for all these years. A judge used Victoria's story to write up a report about the need for additional CPS investigators and how they needed better training. Nobody wanted to take responsibility. Neighborhood residents found themselves defending why they hadn't done anything to intervene. A neighbor who lived down the street told reporters, "I wanted to call, but what do you say? I didn't have enough information. I was just going to watch and listen and see if I could pick up on something. I wish I had called when I first suspected that something was amiss." When Diana and Edna, Victoria's mother and grandmother, weren't immediately thrown in jail for abuse, people were furious. Someone needed to be held accountable. The state was given permanent custody of Victoria, and an investigation into the Barrs was conducted. Maybe everything wasn't black and white. Maybe the Barrs weren't some kind of monsters. Charles and Edna Barr were married in the late 1940s and had owned the house at 802 Blanco Street for years. By the late 1980s, 2 out of 3 of their adult children were still living with them, Clyde and Diana. The Barrs mostly kept to themselves, only occasionally spotted around the neighborhood. As far back as anyone could remember, the blinds in the Barrs' home were closed at all times, and they never let anybody come inside. In 1987, neighbors noticed that 36-year-old Diana was pregnant, something that surprised them since she had a number of learning disabilities and spent most of her time at home. No one was aware of any men she was dating. On January 30th, 1988, Diana gave birth to a 6-pound, 5-ounce baby girl at Seton Medical Center. Diana named her Victoria, after one of her favorite characters on the television series The High Chaparral. 3 days later, after being discharged from the hospital, the two returned to the house on Blanco Street. Nobody knew who Victoria's father was. Diana never named him publicly. For most of Diana's life, her father Charles, a retired butcher with the Texas State School for the Deaf, provided for the family and somewhat maintained the house. But when his health started to decline in the early 90s, the family began struggling, living on Social Security and what little Diana earned working in the kitchen at Fur's Cafeteria, a restaurant chain known for its buffet-style dining. It was around that time when they stopped taking 18-month-old Victoria to the doctor. Diana said she could already tell that her daughter was different. She walked on her tiptoes and took longer to understand things, claiming that it was these delays that stopped her from sending her daughter to school, saying, "We didn't know what else to do for her. She was acting different, funny. She wasn't talking. She wasn't responding the way a little girl should. I didn't want her to have to go through what I did. I didn't want her going to school and being teased like they did to me. We were afraid that if we sent her to school and something happened to her, she couldn't tell us." In 1995, when Charles died, things went from bad to worse. The house, which was already in need of work, fell further into disrepair. Neighbors said that rats were living in a nest on the front porch and could be seen climbing up the screen door. Strange moaning noises could be heard coming from the house, leading some to believe that it was haunted. Social workers believe that Edna suffered from a mild form of dementia. A court-ordered psychological examination of Diana revealed that she had a first-grade level understanding of reading, writing, and arithmetic. The examination also found that Diana showed little inclination to independently assess or judge situations by herself. And beyond Diana's work at Fur's cafeteria or the occasional trip to the grocery store, the two women had nearly no contact with the outside world. They spent a good portion of their days in total silence, with the lights off. Their meals consisted mostly of TV dinners, cereal, and bread. They rarely turned on the television, and their only reading material was the Bible. CPS investigators didn't ask for criminal charges to be filed against the Barrs. They felt that Diana and Edna didn't fit the profile of abusive adults. CPS caseworker Marianne Fisher, who has a PhD in educational psychology, said, "I know this sounds strange, but the more time you spent with them, the more you realize they didn't have a mean bone in their bodies. They loved Victoria. They never abused her. They just didn't have the skills or mental facilities to take care of themselves, let alone take care of her." When journalist Skip Hollandsworth spoke to Diana, he described meeting a meek, fragile woman who seemed intellectually limited. When he asked her why she hadn't tried to kill the rats in the house, she said she was afraid that their little dog would eat the rat poison and die. It was almost as if the possibility of other options didn't exist. Experts who study Victoria say that it's likely she suffered from some sort of brain disorder, but to what extent? How much of her behavior was due to impairment she was born with? And how much of it was a result of her growing up in a neglectful, isolated environment? Because Victoria had been taken to a pediatrician until she was just shy of 2 years old, there were some records to look back on. Her doctors never noted any abnormalities, no signs of delays, autism, or muscle and nerve damage that would have prevented her from speaking. After she was taken from the home in 1997, she underwent a series of tests: an EEG, an MRI, an autonomic brainstem response, and later a Fragile X test. Assessments that look for abnormalities in the brain or chromosomal damage that would have suggested cognitive impairments. The test results indicated that there were no abnormalities or damage. She was quote-unquote normal. Researchers also administered a number of intelligence and behavior tests, in which Victoria scored at a profound level of intellectual disability. But here's the thing. These tests don't paint an accurate picture of a person's abilities. If Victoria was given a fresh start and placed in an enriched, nurturing environment, would she be able to speak, learn? Naturally, Victoria's case garnered scientific interest. For researchers, this was another opportunity to study theories about how the brain works, how children acquire language, and how much we're truly affected by our environment. Experts from around the U.S. petitioned to examine and treat her, including an anthropologist in California who had studied wolves in the wilds and thought he could offer insight into Victoria. Richard Lavallo, Victoria's court-appointed lawyer, and CPS supervisor Christine Blackstone wanted to make sure that their young client didn't become some kind of spectacle. They did allow a few experts to work with her. One was Professor Dina Granoff from the University of Texas, who specialized in teaching communication skills to children with traumatic disabilities. During Professor Granoff's time with Victoria, she noted that the young girl spent hours rocking back and forth, flapping her arms and hands, and tapping her fingers together. Behaviors that Granoff felt were Victoria's way of coping in a world she didn't understand. Granoff also noted that Victoria never responded when people addressed her. In fact, she didn't even look their way. Granoff compared Victoria's language skills to that of an infant who hadn't yet learned pre-linguistic communication like eye contact. Dina said, "She was one of the most severe cases of social and educational deprivation I had seen. No one had any way of knowing what she was thinking." While Victoria was still living in the children's shelter, she was enrolled at Rosedale, an Austin public school dedicated to students with special needs. But deciding Victoria should go and getting her to go were two different things. Victoria liked being in one room where she felt safe and comfortable. It took more than a week of trying to even get her onto the school bus. Once at Rosedale, Victoria was placed in a class with the most severely disabled students. Victoria required constant supervision. She was always trying to take her clothes off, urinate on the floor, or put things in her mouth. Victoria's teacher showed her how to use things over and over, hoping she would eventually understand what to do. Weeks passed, and then her teachers began to notice something. It was subtle, but it was a sign nonetheless. The teachers at Rosedale noticed that Victoria was starting to look around the classroom. She began to get curious about her environment. She noticed the other students, even made eye contact with one of them. A few weeks later at the children's shelter, while Victoria was in her room, Susan Wills, the director, came in to check on her. As Victoria sat in a corner rocking back and forth, Susan set her coffee cup down and walked over to the window. Suddenly, she heard a noise. As Susan turned around, she saw Victoria inching toward her, and in her hand was Susan's coffee cup. Victoria placed it on the windowsill. Susan said, "I stared at the coffee, then I stared at Victoria. I thought, there's a light on in this little girl. There's a light on." Victoria was removed from her home on Blanco Street in October of 1997, and by November of that same year, she had moved in with her new foster parents, Eduardo and Gladys Venegas, a middle-aged couple who had grown children and were now living alone on 5 acres just outside of Austin. They had the time, patience, and dedication to give Victoria everything she needed, including teaching her the most basic human functions: how to get dressed, how to brush her teeth, and even how to use a fork. Her foster father said, "When we first got her, if she were to get paper, she would shred it up. She was making the rats' nest in return for them being in there with her and helping her out." Gladys and Eduardo wanted to make sure she adjusted to her new home. For the first 4 months, her foster mother slept on a mattress next to Victoria's bed. Nights seemed to be the hardest for her. They also needed to help Victoria acclimate to the world. She was scared of almost everything: toilets, bicycles, radios. Her foster parents made sure to talk out loud about everything they were doing. They wanted Victoria to hear spoken language and put words to the activities they were doing. And while Victoria mostly stared blankly into the distance, there were moments when certain things seemed to register with her, like songs from the TV series Barney and Friends. She also seemed to recognize the Bible. It was the only book she didn't try to put in her mouth. Her maternal grandmother, Edna, would later say that she read the Bible to Victoria nightly. For the next year, Victoria's progress was much like that of a roller coaster, filled with highs and lows. She was mostly potty trained and could make eye contact. She learned how to dress herself and how to use a fork. However, most days she seemed unaware of her surroundings, even when someone was sitting right beside her. Other times, it appeared that she knew much more than she was letting on. Her teachers were shocked to see her completing wooden puzzles designed for toddlers all on her own. They also noticed that Victoria began to look at herself in mirrors, poking curiously at parts of her body, a sign that she may have been developing self-awareness. In February of 1998, Victoria was moved to mainstream classes with children her own age in hopes that it would help her foster her abilities. A teacher's assistant was assigned to help Victoria most of the day, and a group of students volunteered to help her get off the bus, get to her locker, walk to class with her, and sit with her at lunch. Putting Victoria in mainstream classes was paying off. At lunch, she began pointing to the food she wanted. She could also signal that she needed to use the bathroom. Then, one day at lunch, Victoria was sitting with the group of girls in the cafeteria. She had her sandwich but wouldn't eat it. Instead, she kept tapping on the closed lunchbox of the girl beside her. Victoria wouldn't start eating until her friend got out her lunch too. In the summer of 1999, Professor Granoff arranged for Victoria to attend a YMCA day camp for non-disabled children. She sent 2 of her undergrad students to accompany her, Marissa Leon and Karen Bross. Both were majoring in speech pathology and given strict instruction that they weren't to act like therapists. Victoria was so overwhelmed on her first day that she wouldn't leave the entrance of the YMCA. Marissa and Karen knew that if this was going to work, they needed to connect with Victoria through play. Together, the girls played basketball, went fishing, swam, and played board games. Karen later said, "We had this spooky feeling that there was all this intelligence inside Victoria that she just wasn't letting out. There were times Marissa and I would be joking or talking, and we'd turn to Victoria and say, 'We know you know what we're saying,' and she'd start giggling." It was towards the end of camp that Victoria shocked everyone and began talking. One day while the girls were in the bathroom, Karen took a drink of water and swished it around her mouth. Victoria looked at Karen and said, "Water." A few days later, while they were swimming, Victoria tried going to the deep end. As Marissa held her back, Victoria said, "I want go." Victoria was slowly beginning to interact with the world around her. She started using more words. She would say "get" when the family dog was trying to lick her, and more when she wanted more food. Not only that, but she was also reacting to what was being said to her. If her foster mother asked her to make her bed, Victoria would. If she was asked to pick up her dirty laundry, she did it. Despite the amazing progress Victoria was making, she was still profoundly disabled. And while she could speak a few words, most of her vocalizing remained in the form of squeaking and moaning. Even though her mother, Diana, had lost her custodial rights, she was still granted supervised visits. To CPS, it was clear that Diana loved her daughter, and there seemed to be no reason to keep them from seeing each other. The Barr family sold their home on Blanco Street, and Diana moved to an apartment in South Austin. She began working with different agencies to receive support. She started therapy, took parenting classes, learned how to manage her money, and keep a clean home. Victoria had spent her early years hidden away from the world, but as she entered her teen years, life began to open up for her. She could communicate in her own way, and in 2002 began learning how to sign simple words. Please, thank you, excuse me, and I'm sorry. She had a host of supportive friends. The high school band made her their mascot, and she was even named the honorary homecoming queen during her sophomore year. And while Victoria would remain in high school until her 22nd birthday, learning life and job skills, in May of 2007, when she was 18 years old, she participated in her class's graduation ceremony, cap, gown, and all. So how did Victoria fall through the cracks, despite all the calls that had been placed on her behalf? According to an internal investigation of CPS, it all came down to lost paperwork. Linda Edwards, a spokesperson for the Department of Protective and Regulatory Services, said, "We should have followed up, and we did not. And that's because the case paperwork was lost." Linda said that a second caseworker had visited the Barr's home, unaware that another caseworker was already investigating the family. The second caseworker had Diana agree to improve the living conditions, but when she learned that another colleague was already involved, she handed the case back to him. That's when the file supposedly disappeared. The original caseworker claims he never saw the paperwork, but the second caseworker said she's sure she gave it to him. Since nobody could determine who lost the file, nobody was reprimanded or disciplined. Doctors eventually diagnosed Victoria with intellectual disability and autism. Judge Scott McCown ruled that it was in her best interest to remain with her foster parents. Unfortunately, not much is known about Victoria today. As of 2007, she had aged out of foster care and is now overseen by the Department for Disability and Age Services. It's unclear if she still lives with the Venegas family or if she's in a group home. Those who have met Victoria are struck by her gentle nature. Her attorney, Richard Lavallo, said, "It's not just her past that deeply affects you. It's that Victoria remains so full of goodwill." It's hard not to wonder what kind of person Victoria would be today had she not spent so much of her childhood in neglect. I can't help but think about Jeannie Wiley and what she went through in the 1970s. If you're not familiar, I did a deep dive on her and highly recommend checking it out. I've done a lot of thinking about both Victoria and Diana. To me, they were both victims. Just knowing that Diana had a number of disabilities herself and somehow ended up pregnant is devastating. I keep going back to the fact that she wouldn't name Victoria's father. Has she been keeping a secret for someone else all these years? I know that I've given you a lot to unpack today, but I cannot wait to hear from you guys. Had you heard about Victoria before today's video? If you lived in the Austin area around the time of this case, what was your perception of it? Did you feel that Diana and Edna should have been charged? Or did you think that they were also victims? If you appreciated today's video, give it a thumbs up, and hey, while you're at it, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss out on the next investigation.